the Techlahoma YouTube channel sometime in the future. Okay, today we are going to talk about a testing framework called Peridot. It is a behavior-driven test framework. These are getting kind of popular now. Instead of unit testing, which kind of happens after the fact a lot of times, behavior-driven can be done ahead of time. You write out the behavior that you expect your application to exhibit, and then build the test for it. It makes it easier to do test-driven development. Okay. So we're going to use for this our application that we did a couple of months ago. It's just a very simple little application with a single service, which we call the useful service. The useful service requires an indispensable repository and a log or a logger interface. And then it has just one little function here, the process, which calls the repository to select the big clients, and then it loops through the clients and basically just prints their name into the log. So very simple service, but this will illustrate some of the concepts that we're interested in, like the fact that the services here are injected into the constructor by using a dependency injection container that allows us to test things more flexibly. We can replace these services when we do testing. We can replace them with a mock instance of that class and do whatever we want to within the mock and make sure that things were called correctly. Here's how we did it last time with the unit test. You see in our setup method, we created a mock for the logger interface, and we created a mock for the indispensable repository, and then we caused the container, the dependency injection container, to use our mock instances here, this repo. We use that in place of the actual class. So when we instantiated the useful service, also through the container, it utilized those mocks instead of using the actual classes. Then our test was pretty straightforward. We just told the repository to return an array of objects when it was called, and we tested that that there were 5 of those counted up, and it returns that result as from the service. Okay. So this time we're going to do things a little differently. We're going to start by creating a spec directory to hold our behavioral tests. And within that directory, I'll create another one for service spec tests. And then down in the service directory, we create a new, now this is not a class, this will just be a PHP file. And it's going to have the same name as the service that we're testing, useful service.spec.php. So, and I'm using PHP Storm. It's going to put the .php on the end of that anyway. So, all right, here I have useful service.spec.php, and this is just a PHP file, just like you would use, just plain vanilla stuff. It's not going to have a class in it at all. We're actually going to start by calling the describe method. And it's not recognized, which reminds me, I forgot to install the testing framework. Let's look back at our composer.json. We'll be installing this through composer.json. So last month we added PHP unit and mockery. So this time we're going to do composer require, and this is a dev requirement, which will place it into the require dev. It will not be required for production deployment. and I have to remember the path here for the Peridot. I think it's Peridot PHP. Let me look it up, actually. Yeah, here we go. Peridot PHP, and then just /Peridot. I'm also going to use prophecy along with this. We'll use prophecy as a mock to create the mocks, and we'll use Leo for some assertion type stuff. So hang on one second. I'm trying to find the link to Leo. Okay, I know it's here somewhere, but I think we can just say Leo, and it will tell me if I get this wrong. The Peridot prophecy plugin. I don't even have to tell it, if I get these right, I don't even have to tell it that I'm requiring Peridot, because it will know that Leo requires Peridot and the prophecy plugin requires Peridot. So something went wrong. Yes. Okay. We have a dependency conflict. This happens occasionally. And in this case, prophecy plugin, let's see. There's a problem with the PHP unit PHP timer that some of the Peridot plugin requires a timer of one version, and then it looks like PHP unit requires a newer version. So, okay, what we do here to resolve this, I'm going to take PHP unit out for the moment, and I'm going to tell Composer to remove PHP unit, and Composer doesn't have a prune or that sort of thing. We'll just tell it to install, and it says I'm up to date because it's looking at the composer.lock file. All right, one thing after another, right? We'll delete the lock file, that's okay. We still have the JSON file. Now install, it will look at the JSON file, and it removes a bunch of PHP unit stuff. That's fine now. So then we'll install prophecy and all of its stuff. And if we needed to, at this point, then we can go back and reinstall PHP unit, and it would choose a version of PHP unit that is compatible with all the stuff that's already installed with prophecy. So that would be how you resolve those composer conflicts generally. That's one approach. All right, now here we go. It has added, Composer has added these lines to my composer.json file. So everything's installed now. If I come back over here, it should recognize, yeah, now it recognizes, no, it doesn't recognize the describe command. All right. Let me think about that a little more, and while I'm thinking about it, we'll move forward. Ordinarily with the describe command, you give it a top-level name. So this test is going to affect, or is going to test things about the useful service. And within that test, so the second parameter here is going to be a function with no parameters. Within that, we can say content. Yeah, see now it's, okay, PHP Storm has caught up with me now, and it's recognizing the describe function. So within describe, we can use context to describe a little further about what we're going to test here. We can actually use describe again if we chose to, but we'll use context. And it also, second parameter, is just a function with no arguments. And within that, we'll say it should do something useful. All right? This is the structure generally for these kind of tests, for behavior-driven tests. This all comes from Cucumber, which is one of the original behavior-driven test frameworks. And these are all behavior-driven tools pretty much support the same kind of structure to their testing language. Peridot in particular can do a lot more if you configure it properly. It can do domain-specific languages, which makes the test even more readable. But that's one of the advantages to the behavior-driven tests. They should be very readable. So here again, it needs a function. And now we've reached the last level. So inside this function, we're actually going to do something that looks like a test. So what we're going to do is, just like last month, we're going to capture the result, and we're going to call the service and tell it to run the process. And I've got 3 S's. That's wrong. Okay. But we haven't defined this service yet, have we? So let's go back and do that in a setup function. Under PHP unit, this is called setup. But in this case, Peridot supports a before each method. And within that for each method, now I'm going to create all my mocks, and I'm going to instantiate that service. Okay, so I'm going to say this service equals new useful service. Okay, and it needs a repository and a log. So let's create those. I want them to be visible from the test, so I'm going to make it this repository and this log. All right, so this repository, now I'm going to use Prophet to create a mock. The first thing I'm going to have to do, I'm backing up again, I'm going to have to get a hold of Prophet. And all I have to do is call the function to get a hold of Prophet. Now, we haven't set up Prophet, actually, but we'll come back to that in one moment. Okay, what I would do is prophesize. This is a funny word. I'm not sure whether that's a real word or not. And then I tell it what class I want it to mock. So the indispensable repository class. And remember when I put the : class on the end of it, calling that as if it's a static method, that will return a string that represents the name of the class. And I'll do the same thing with log, Prophet, and I need the logger interface right there. Okay, now one thing I've forgotten here is that when I hand this off to the service, I have to actually reveal the mock to the service in order to make that work. And I could let that go and see what the error looks like, but right now, let's just try this. This should actually run. There's nothing really going on in the test. There are no assertions being called, but it should actually run. If I do vendor bin peridot, there is an executable file there that should run Peridot against whatever tests I have. And that does not look like my test, does it? It's got a bunch of stuff in it. Actually, what's happening is Peridot is running its own tests because it doesn't know where mine are. So, configuring Peridot then. Peridot uses a file in your base directory called Peridot PHP. Again, it's not a class, it's just a PHP file, and it has to return a function. And that function will get executed. And this function now receives a parameter. It's going to receive the event emitter interface from eventaments. We'll call that emitter. Okay. So within this little function, now I can do configuration stuff. I can get a hold of Peridot events. Now, Peridot is constructed so that it throws off certain events when things happen within your test, like if it's starting a test or ending a test or a test fails or a test is being configured. It throws these events, and those are places where we can get a hold of it and make something different happen and configure it for our environment. And the emitter is what gives us the opportunity to do that. So you can see the events, or the methods that are supported by the emitter here. There's on. When on an event, this is event-based programming. You've seen that before, I'm sure. So if I do an on a particular event, then my function's going to run every time. If I do once, it's going to run the first time, and then it won't run after that. And then you can do various things with the listeners and such. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is an on, and the event that I want to capture is called peridot.configure, because that's what I need to do right now. I need to tell it where my tests are, and that's a configuration option. So again, we're going to put a function in here. This listener is just a function, an anonymous function, and it's going to receive two arguments, if I remember them correctly. The first one is a Peridot configuration. Yeah, there it is, configuration. The Peridot configuration, we're going to receive an instance of that. And the second one, let's see if PHP Storm will help me out on that. I believe it's going to receive a copy of the Peridot application, but I don't actually need it for what I'm doing here. So I'll just skip that second parameter and leave that out entirely. I don't actually have to name it in my function. So when I get this configuration, here we go. Lots of things I could do to the configuration. These DSLs are interesting. I want to look at that in more depth one of these days when I have time. There's the get path. What I really want to do here is set path. And I'm just going to set it to specs, which is the directory that we created just a few minutes ago. Okay. Now, if I go back down here and I run Peridot, cannot load path specs. That's not what I wanted to see. I wonder if I need to put full path here like that. Still doesn't like it. Okay, it's obviously seen my configuration change, but I've not got the right path for it. Let me see. Oh, because I got an S on the end. That's wrong. Okay. One more time, and there it goes. It ran the useful service, and you see the description that it puts out here is a concatenation of all the things that I told it in the describe and the context and the it method. So useful service process should do something useful. All of that. So that tells you if the test fails, as it does right here, that tells you where to look. Undefined offset 0 in some scope.php thing that is part of Peridot. Okay. Well, I'm not entirely sure what that is, but I think, since I haven't configured prophecy, I think that's what's going on. So let's fix prophecy right here, because that's another configuration thing. And all I have to do is new, is it Peridot prophecy? I have to create the class that links together Peridot and prophecy. Let me go look at the vendor directory real quick. Under Peridot PHP, under the plugin, there's an example. Yeah. Well, the example doesn't remind me how to configure. There it is. That's what I want. This right here. Now, I really just need this part. This doesn't matter. I'm not going to do anything else with it, so I don't need to capture that new instance. I just have to create the new instance. And within its construction, okay, PHP Storm doesn't recognize it because I didn't include it up here. Within its constructor, apparently it will connect itself to that in the Peridot events that it needs. So I'm going to tell PHP Storm here to import the class, which is a pretty cool little function. And now we'll try to run that test again. We got something different anyway, so that was part of the problem. Invalid arguments applied for each on line 31 of my spec. No, on line 31 of my service. So line 31 of my service is for each client's. Okay. So what's happened in the test is we called the process. The process called the repository, the mock repository. But it didn't return anything appropriate here. So we need to tell the mock what it's supposed to return. All this other stuff is now working, which is cool. I need to tell that mock that when it receives this, select major components. Now, prophecy is kind of cool here. The way you tell it what method it's going to receive is to just call the method, and it apparently takes care of that. So select major clients and return, let's see, will return. I need to return some kind of an array with some stuff in it. Remember last time we returned this kind of array, we had to create an object. This array had to be a bunch of objects. I'll just copy this. All right, so I've got this is just a little array, and then I'm casting it into an object with this thing right here. So now I'm returning an array of objects. All right, let's see what happens with my test. It looks like it passed. But in fact, there are no assertions here anything could have happened in that process. We don't know. One thing I want to do here is say that the log should be called. The log info, I think. Say log info should be called. And I want to say that this result, now this is the Leo stuff. We're going to say expect result to equal, and we're going to expect that result to be 5 because we're passing it 5 objects. We should see it would loop through there 5 times. That's what it's counting in the service. It's counting how many clients were passed into it actually. But, okay, so I should see that result equal to 5. Let's make it 3 so it'll throw an error. And we'll see what happens. Okay, call to undefined function should be called. Oh, yeah, typo. Okay, now process should do something useful. Method call info with an argument of A was not expected. The expected calls were info with no argument, so it did call it, but it should have had A here, all right? Now I've got one it called info with the B argument, which is, of course, what it does the second time through the loop. So I need to have an expectation for each of those. And now we're down to, it looks like those all succeeded. And we got down to this, this test, this assertion, and it did not pass because it's 3 and it should have been 5. Okay, now we make it 5. It looks like everything passed, but what if we add one here? Because I've actually forgotten to do something, and I know I've forgotten it. Okay. Now I told it that it should, the log info should be called with an argument of F. We're not passing an object with the name F, so that can't happen. Even though I've got should be called here, it's not working. It's not actually checking those assertions. And the reason is I forgot to tell it to check those assertions. So obviously, you should go do that. Oops. I need to get profits. And then I think it's check prophecies, actually. That doesn't look right. Prophecies, if I can spell prophecies correctly. We'll see. It'll throw an error if I type that wrong. Yeah, doesn't like it. Call to undefined method. Let's see if I can find it real quick. You can see the Leo stuff there. Let's see if I've never looked at this prophecy code. Let's see if we can track it down here. Yeah, check predictions. Okay, that's what I need. Okay. So I checked the predictions, and no calls have been made that match the F parameter. So yay, that's right, because we didn't tell it, we didn't give it an F thing. Okay, so now we know it's checking those predictions or prophecies. We also know it's checking this result. So this is the way assertions are done with Leo. This Leo package is kind of cool. Let's look at that. We can do expect result is greater than 3. This is kind of looks odd because there are no parens on this to make it method functions. But that's obviously being done with magic methods. So we can say expect result greater than 3 to be true. Actually, I think I can leave it off there too. Let me see. Yeah, that passes, see? Other things you can do with Leo, like if I could type expect. Okay, if I give it an array, or if I receive a result back that is an array with a bunch of integers here, to match, yeah, to match. And then I test it against something that's not quite the same. I can actually make this work, I think. Okay, the pattern matcher fails here because it's not an exact match, but that's because it's doing exact comparison. And I can tell it to do an inexact or loose comparison. Remember, if we're doing exact comparison, result equals 3, then result has to be a number. The type has to match also. But if we do it equal, then the type does not have to match. This could be a string 3 in the result, and it would still match. I could say here, for instance, matches a string 5. We know that result is actually going to be an integer 5, but that should still be true. Pattern matcher expects a string on 24. A pattern matcher. Oh. I'm not sure which one failed. Let's set that back to something that's true, that I know will pass. Okay. There we go. So if I can tell it to loosely equal, and the array then does match, even though some of these elements are string in this one and they are integers in the other one. So I'll go back to this one just for fun. Let's see if that's still true. It should be, because results should be 5. We just tested that it's equal to a numeric 5. Yes. So this is the loose comparison. However, if I do it with tight comparison and checking the types are not the same, so that test fails. So, okay. Anyway, the expect and the Leo stuff has some other cool syntax for testing that things are the same, like let's say we expect a certain kind of class. Expect result to be, you don't have to have all the words in there, you can skip them. To be instance of, let's say, object. No, it's not an object. This is going to fail. Result is an integer, right? So, yeah, expected 5 to be instance of object. That doesn't work. Let's say not to be instance of object. And that passes. So, cool stuff that Leo can do. All right. So we've seen how the testing framework for the behavior-driven design is set up. We've seen some of the language that it uses, the describe, context, and it. And then there could be multiple it tests. It should do this, it should do that, it should do something else. We've seen how to create mocks using profit and how to inject those into the new service that we're testing, the subject under test, using the reveal method. Okay, we've looked at a little bit how we can do some configuration changes on Peridot and how we connect prophecy to it. So that's all we got for this week or this month. All right, thanks for coming.